engineering and technical skills is knowing how to make a McDonald's snack wrap. Being an architect is knowing why the McDonald's snack wrap is on the menu. And I'll take it one step further. If you want to get into an analyst role, it's understanding why McDonald's brought the snack wrap back right now. The atomic unit of work that people are doing now is an application. It's not a system. It's not an operating system. It's a thing that I do on my device. Then securing it at that atomic level is absolutely critical. And that's why I think that SquareX is an interesting solution for doing that, because they're doing it in a way that provides security and safety without being obtrusive. If someone's telling you to do something and can't justify why they're doing it, it's either a really bad decision or there needs to be more thought put into it. And I can't promise you that you won't ever get in trouble for asking questions, but I can promise you that if you ask the right questions, you'll be able to sleep at night knowing that if this is the way things have to be, at least I made sure that that is exactly why they have to be the way they are.
Some people fix networks, others build communities. Tom Hollingsworth does both. With more than 20 years in enterprise networking under his belt, Tom has evolved from troubleshooting school district networks to becoming the voice behind Tech Field Day, the industry's most influential networking events. Tom, thanks for being with us here today on the Be Fearless podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your foundation, kind of where you started. You're known as the networking nerd. Tell us about that brand and how you decided to embrace that identity in the networking world.
So when I started off doing my old job for a reseller, I was very heavily focused on servers, Novell NetWare specifically. But I realized there was a gap in what our company was offering, and specifically around the networking space. And so I started really diving into that headlong. And then fast forward a few years, and I started getting active on social media. And of course, you got to come up with a cool handle, right? Well, somebody had Network Nerd. Like, oh man, I do networks. I'm kind of nerdy, not just about networking, but sci-fi and history and all kinds of stuff. That'd be perfect. And I was like, well, wait a minute. What if I just add an ing to the end of network? And lo and behold, it was taken. It wasn't taken, I'm sorry. So it was taken as soon as I was able to register it. And then, of course, I started building my brand around that, domain names and handles and pretty much everything. And I lucked out, it was early days of social media, so nothing was really taken at that point. And it allowed me to kind of establish my presence there. And of course, over the years, I've still become very identified with networking. So that's helped out quite a bit, even though we've seen the industry shift into other areas. It still helps that, when I introduce myself, everyone's like, oh, yeah, I know who you are. I've read your stuff, or I've listened to your podcast, or things like that.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. You brought me back to like really old times, like Novell networks. I remember that was a big thing when I was early in my IT career. So the networking nerd, you were able to get like the domain name and everything else and just kind of build a brand. I mean, that must have been like the late 90s, early 2000s, or
not quite that much. I did get started in IT in the early 2000s, but it just like anybody else, I was on the ground floor. I was doing a lot of work with desktops and things like that. But my boss then decided to kind of promote me up to being in the engineering department, where I was building things instead of just fixing them. And it was around 2009, 2010 when I really kind of established that presence. And part of it was me going out there and studying for my CCIE. I was reading a lot of information from some great people in the community, like Ethan Banks, and he had a blog and a Twitter and eventually a podcast. And I'm like, well, I need two of those things in order to really participate. So I started a blog and I started a Twitter handle, and luckily both of those brands were available. So in a way, I needed to step out of where I was, because I live in Oklahoma, which is, not really known for being a bastion of technological superiority. But if you want to really participate in the community, boundaries don't mean much, but you have to have a way to connect with people. And that was the original drive behind what I wanted to do.
Oh, yeah, that's very interesting. Again, it doesn't seem early, I guess, anymore, but I guess it does seem early to people. I had my own company, and I remember back in those days, it was like you're right. I mean, it was just easier to get domain names. It was easier to get handles. It was easier to, kind of get those things kind of settled. Today, it's a much more difficult situation. But anyways, so you've been in Tech Field Day for 14 years. Can you share the story of how you became involved with that organization and what the first Field Day event was like?
Yeah, we once I started getting more out there in social media and interacting with people in the community, I got into this conversation one time with this guy named Stephen Foskett. I think we were talking about Amiga computers and just an offhand comment, because I was a Commodore guy growing up, so I never had an Amiga. I went straight from Commodore to DOS 5.0. But through this conversation, I didn't think anything was going to come of it until I got a DM on Twitter in early 2011 that said, hey, would you be interested in being a part of Tech Field Day coming up in February? And I remember I was driving somewhere and I almost drove off the road. I was like, me? You want me to come to this cool thing that you're doing where I get to talk to a whole bunch of other nerds from around the country? So I filled out the form real quick and got invited out to be a delegate in early 2011. And I loved it. It was everything I had wanted from being a part of the community. And fast forward 2 years, I DM'd Steven and I said, I'm really getting frustrated with my job. I don't really feel like there's a good direction for me. I think I actually said the words, I feel like I'm rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And he said, well, you're coming out to Networking Field Day next month. Let's talk about your future. And I'll never forget what he said right after that. The next message was, have you ever considered becoming the Dread Pirate Roberts? I think you'd make an excellent Dread Pirate Roberts. And that was literally my job offer, to come work for Tech Field Day. And so we talked about it. I started a couple of months later. Kind of funny enough, I was a senior network engineer working on, storage arrays and servers and these big complicated networks. And then a week later, I was doing video editing and I was calling hotels for reservations and, taking briefings from companies and things like that. Well, that was in 2013. So that was 12 years ago and I've been doing that ever since. Obviously the role that I do here at Field Day has changed quite a bit, but it's never changed that feeling of community and camaraderie that I have with not only Steven, but the rest of the great people that I work with. It really does feel like we're one big family. I know that gets overused a lot in a lot of cultures, but it does feel like that around here. We joke, I'm the crazy weird uncle and all the other people that I work with, I do literally anything for them. And I feel like that's one of the things that drives what we do in the community, is that it's more than a paycheck. It's more than a deliverable. It's creating a sense of identity with people that you really do feel like they care.
You've been working with these folks for a long time. You know them pretty well. Y'all have been through, imagine, a number of field days together. I mean, how often do you have a Tech Field Day event?
On average, we have about one every 3 to 4 weeks. We try to keep a regular cadence of doing different verticals. So like, for example, we try to have a couple of events focused on security every year, but I have to avoid the big conventions, right? Like I can't do anything around RSAC. I can't do anything around Black Hat. So then what do we do in August and whenever they have RSAC next year? Well, what if we did something that isn't focused on security? What if we did AI Field Day? Or what if we did, Mobility Field Day, where we talk about wireless infrastructure? I mean, yes, those all touch security, but you can see, it's kind of like the draft board, right? Like we have all these things up on the board and we're trying to figure out where we can put these things and where we need to go next. And there's always somebody out doing something fun, which is great for us because it helps with awareness of what Field Day is all about.
Yeah, so Tech Field Day is kind of considered an IT influencer event. I'm not too sure I understand what that means. Can you explain that a little bit to me?
Yeah, the way that it started out was Stephen Foskett, the founder, actually got together with a group of people online and said, we all know a little bit about our different areas, whether it's storage or networking or compute or whatever. Wouldn't it be great if we had a place where we could go and kind of exchange ideas and basically make the whole greater than the sum of its parts? And if you're familiar with psychology, you know that is known as the Gestalt. Well, that's where the original website came from, Gestalt IT. And because of this, a lot of these people kind of got noticed a little bit. And eventually they all got invited to Hewlett Packard was running a blogger event where they would invite people who were writing about technology to come out and spend a couple of days learning about HP technology. This is not all that uncommon in the space. And I remember this is the story as Stephen relates it. They were all sitting around having drinks one night, and a couple of the people kind of commented, man, wouldn't it be great if we could do this, but it be companies that weren't HP, like just other companies in the space? And everyone, you know how it is when someone comes up with an idea, they all laugh like, man, that'd really be great. Stephen actually got up and left, and he walked outside the room and he called one of his friends who works in the event management space and said, hey, I want to do this thing. And she said, awesome. How much time do I have? And he said, I want to do it next month. And then she laughed. And then he said, I'm serious. And that was Tech Field Day 1 back in 2009. And from there, it has just exploded, because while everybody else thought, man, that's a great idea, Stephen made it a thing. And so from that point forward, we've searched out new companies, we've picked up and coming people from the community, and just grown it to where it is an independent group of practitioners who have an influence on the way that the community goes, right? Because we know that there are people in the space that are professional analysts, and they get paid to do the thing that they do. We reach out to the people who do it because they love technology, because they're trying to establish themselves. And sometimes their perspectives are different because they're grounded in the actual implementation of the technology, not just looking at it from a theoretical perspective.
Right. I think that what I love about the CISO community, right, is that we kind of come together sometimes at Black Hat, sometimes at RSAC. Now, I lived a lot of time in Asia and Singapore and Japan. Some places like Singapore has a great CISO community that get together pretty often, just during the year, as opposed to US, it seems like we get together at conferences. Mm-hmm. And then in Japan, it was really light. But one of the nice things about having the community is that you can exchange ideas. Even though I may be having a problem right now, I'm hoping that someone that I know had the same problem and can tell me a little bit about how they addressed it. And then we can talk about the specifics. There's a lot of specifics around, how companies do their architecture and everything else that make some solutions better for them and some solutions worse for them. And they may be great solutions, but they may not particular use cases. It seems like that's kind of just in different parts of the industry, not just security, but in other parts that y'all are just kind of bringing these folks together and getting everyone to kind of share their experience about the technologies that are in play.
That's the number one thing that the delegates tell me is the takeaway for them from the event is they get a lot of great information, but they get a chance to kind of talk to their peers and they get to bounce ideas off of each other. I love that so many of them have, brought up things like I'm dealing with this problem at work. Have you ever seen this? Or, hey, has anybody used this new technology? I'm thinking about implementing it. Even just people who have gotten together and love talking to each other so much, they've started a podcast from just hanging out around other people. It warms my heart because it means that the people connections still matter to everyone. And I know we live in a world now where, we do a lot of remote work. We have a lot of meetings over Zoom. It's easy to be impersonal. And when you get groups of people that have like minds, that have like interests together and just let some magic happen, it really does create something special.
Yeah, I agree. As an event lead at Tech Field Day, you're curating conversations between vendors and independent thought leaders. This is kind of what we've just been talking about. What's your approach to selecting delegates and getting to that meaningful dialogue? Is there a rhyme or a reason to it? How do you get these sessions kind of going?
So there is a little bit of formula behind the magic. We look for certain things with the delegates. The first thing is that they have to be independent. It's kind of one of those things where you can't work for a company that makes stuff like, a router or a server. And part of it comes down to the fact that even though you might be independently minded, you're not completely independent. What would you do if a person who worked for Juniper showed up in the room during a Cisco presentation? Even if they were trying to be neutral, you'd always wonder, are they saying these things because of what they believe or because of who they work for? And now the flip side of that is, because people ask me all the time, well, then if you need to be completely independent, why do you invite people who work for resellers? Because they have agreements with other people. And the funny thing is that when your business depends on being nice to everybody, you're more neutral than a lot of other people, because you kind of have to play nice with everyone. Otherwise, you run into problems. But you have to have an independent mindset, and then you have to be technical in your field. There's a lot of people out there that are very good at convincing you that they know what they're talking about, and they have no depth whatsoever. And that's part of the reason why I love talking to folks, is because I want to hear what they've been working on. I want to hear what they're doing. And you can generally figure out pretty quickly how trained a person is. Have they done a network? Have they created a bridging loop that they've had to solve? That helps, because then that gives them the ability to walk in with authority and say, oh, well, I've seen this before, or this is a new approach. I'm kind of interested to see where you go with it. And then they have to have some kind of a platform. And the reason for that is simple. If you learn something really cool, who are you going to go tell? And I like the people that are willing to create that relationship with their audience, that say, I walked in and I saw a solution from a company and I think it's really great. And I think you should check it out. But I also appreciate the people who say, maybe they need to work a little bit more on these aspects of it, because that creates a relationship with your audience as a trusted advisor. And I know that term is another one that gets completely overused in the industry. And my answer to when people say something about it being overused is said, okay, well, a real trusted advisor has told a customer no. They've said, this is not what you need. This won't work. Where did you buy this? And that creates that legitimacy, if you will. I know what I'm talking about. I understand the challenges. I see where this may fit in a certain specific role. And when people read that, it feels authentic, and that creates that trust relationship. Well, obviously, if he says that it works, it must work, because the track record is, if it didn't work, he'd say it didn't work.
Right. So independent, they must have technical depth, must understand the technology that they're dealing with. And then third, they have a platform. I mean, it's no point in having a conversation and now it's just stuck in somebody's head. You actually have to actually get it out to other people.
And that can be a challenge, because a lot of the delegates that we bring in, they'll tell me, oh, I thought company X did a really great job. And my response immediately is, then write that down. Right. Tell people that they did a great job, not just telling me, because I have a bad memory. If you write it down, at least I can find it through Google later.
Right. And pretty soon ChatGPT. Tell us a story about Tech Field Day event that completely changed your perspective on a particular technology or vendor approach.
Yeah, there's actually one story that comes to mind about this, and it's one of the most famous videos that we've ever released on Tech Field Day, and it came from Ken Duda, the CTO of Arista Networks. Ken's a pretty unassuming guy. When he walks in the room, he's tall. He fits like the central casting mold of what I would consider to be like a nerdy person at a tech company. He gets up and he delivers maybe 20 minutes about code quality. Right. You can already hear the paint drying in the room, right? Like, talk about code quality. It was the passion in Ken's voice that created one of the most amazing moments that we've ever seen. Like, that people care, but to hear someone like him talk about how important this was, to see the way that he was just so animated when he talked about it. How they always talk about things being like a first ballot Hall of Fame or an instant classic when it comes to sports. This was an instant classic. As soon as we got done, like, everyone looked around and they said, we just watched something special. And it shifted the way that I thought about what Arista was doing. When someone that high up in the company comes right out and says, we won't acquire a company if their code is crap, because as soon as we do, that becomes our code and we have to own up to it. Like, that's a different way of thinking about the way that a company does things. And I think that that's been borne out over the years, because this is something that happened years and years ago. The way that they've gone about doing things, as they've become a very serious competitive force in the market. And I think that a lot of it comes from the way that their management looks at the problem. And to think back that the light bulb went off for a lot of us watching this man get up and do it. And that's not the only time he's done it. He's gotten up several times since then in the event and given a different aspect of a discussion that I told the people that I work with at Arista. I said, if Ken ever wants to walk in and just talk he is more than welcome to do so whenever he wants, because whatever comes out of that man's mouth is gold.
Well, I'm going to go find it, because I think that from a security perspective, I see so many people being driven by just getting features delivered. And maybe it does work and maybe sufficient for the job, but for that right then. But man, the technical debt that's caused by code quality and having to fix problems and everything else. I mean, it is a serious concern for, security people, because it just creates bugs and everything else for us, right? And so, I'm definitely going to go watch that one. So you've transitioned from being a hands-on engineer to being recognized as an industry advisor. Was there a particular moment or project that made you realize you wanted to focus more on the strategic side of networking?
I think it was a gradual process of lifting my head up above the keyboard, so to speak. Because when we're technical starting out, there is a way to do things, right? Like, we're going to configure this OSPF process with these certain configuration goals, and we're going to do the thing. And I've told people a lot recently in relation to other things, like, that is knowing how to make a McDonald's snack wrap, right? Like, there is an instruction sheet. You put down the tortilla and the sauce and the lettuce and the chicken strip, and that is the way things are done. And you can do that over and over and over again. But occasionally you have to ask yourself, why? Like, that is the main question that separates technical, operations engineering from more of an architecture role is why? What is it about this that works? Why do I pick that router instead of this one? Why do I use this solution and not that one? Mm-hmm. And when you start asking those questions, you start connecting all of the dots. And that becomes a valuable resource to people, because sometimes they don't do that. They don't ask themselves, well, what happens if I buy this firewall today and it doesn't scale in 4 years? Do I have the money to go buy a new firewall in 4 years? Should I buy that now, knowing that I might hit that target? And there's a lot of work that has to go into that, right? Because you have to understand the business, and you have to understand the likelihood that it can grow or possibly even shrink. And it's a different kind of thought exercise. So yeah, maybe my keyboard skills are a little bit rusty right now, but when someone comes to me with a technology and says, oh, this is the most important thing that you've ever seen, I have enough context around what I do to be able to say, is it though? And if you want to go back to my original analogy, engineering and technical skills is knowing how to make a McDonald's snack wrap. Being an architect is knowing why the McDonald's snack wrap is on the menu. And I'll take it one step further. If you want to get into an analyst role, it's understanding why McDonald's brought the snack wrap back right now, because there's a whole other level of market drivers and forces that even in an analyst role, or in a technical architect role, you don't understand that until you get into analysis. And in case you were curious, the reason why the snack wrap came back was because McDonald's reintroduced chicken strips, which means there are now chicken strips in the restaurant along with the other ingredients, so they can offer a menu item that doesn't have advanced food costs. It's the reason why McRib goes away, is because they don't always carry the pork patties in the restaurant. And see, when you get into that mindset, you even get further away from the technical and architecture and more into a business side discussion. And there's people who can exist on all of that spectrum. Like I said earlier, we tend to focus with people who are a little bit more on that technical side, because that gives a different perspective than someone who maybe grew up and went to B school and got an MBA, and so is coming at the tech side from a business perspective. So they see dollars and cents and we see IP addresses. Somewhere there is a magic mix in the middle that makes both of them valuable to an audience.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I liked your analogy. I mean, especially since you brought it from technical, executing on the bits, the architecture part, and then the business part. Because I think a lot of folks don't really understand that, especially on the cyber side, a lot of things get driven by the business. It becomes a technology problem. And then we're trying to figure out, like, hey, how do we solve the business problem with technology? And then finally, the security folks get involved, and they're like, okay, well, how do I secure this, right? And, you're hoping that as a CISO, I'm trying to influence those technical decisions, because there's a lot of nuances, like you were saying, about why this technology now. Does this technology have a lifetime, right? And when you're going to go implement a technology, maybe this operating system works on this hardware platform today, but here in a month or two, it's going to go end of life or end of sale, and then you won't be able to get support for it. And then you're having to go through operating systems and applications. There's a whole long tail of like, how do you get into the platform, right? And then I always think it's so easy to get into a platform. Mm-hmm. But the other part is that when you want to divorce from that platform or you want to deprecate it, how do you get out? And I think architecturally, you got to kind of understand what those timelines are for the industry. Like, what's your hardware refresh cycle? What's the operating system refresh cycle? What's the application, life cycle? And kind of, you got to think about that over a long period of time so that you know how much cost you're going to have in 3 years, 5 years and such. And I don't think a lot of people think about that. Like I said, it's easy to buy, but it's so much harder to replace. We always think that here's the architecture that we think we're building the company on right now, but we also have like 20 other ones because this company's been around for 35 years and such, and we have like all these legacy systems, and putting all that together, I think, is definitely worthwhile. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about browser security, because I think you had a discussion with Vivek, our founder, recently. Y'all were discussing how the browser become like the true endpoint, not the laptop or mobile device. In your opinion, how should organizations be thinking differently about their security approach?
A lot of what we deal with in IT security is kind of reaching the users where they are. And we've dealt with this for years, right? Like, it used to be that a computer was a thing that sat on a desk and it was behind a firewall and there were no problems because it never left. And so securing it was fairly easy. We create some ACLs in the firewall. Traffic can go out, but it can't come in. That kind of stuff. That's how it was whenever I was interning for IBM. And then I remember they gave me a laptop because it was just easier to give people laptops back then. And I remember thinking, oh, well, can I work from home because I have a laptop so I can bring my work home? And no, you can't, because that's not how we're set up. Fast forward to, today, and the idea of going into an office is like, really? Why do I have to do that? Because the paradigm shifted, right? We went from laptops that had to use VPNs to connect to the corporate network to laptops that use software as a service that was hosted in the cloud. And now a lot of the work that we do is done through applications that are not hosted internal to the network. And that means that the security has shifted away from the enterprise to the device, but now it's to the applications that are being used, because we've come a long way from installing Microsoft Office on your laptop and using everything locally and then emailing files back and forth. That's what I did in college. To now, everything can be done online. Well, then that means that the laptop isn't really that big of a deal anymore. It's the application that I use on it. Think about all of the times that you spent in the past, like installing antivirus on things. Can you install antivirus on a mobile device? Most of the companies will tell you that you don't have a need for it, because the operating system of a mobile device, whether it's a phone or a tablet, is effectively locked down, right? If you, let's just say you're using an iPad, it's actually very difficult to install malware on an iPad because everything is through a curated app store. You're running in user land. There's no elevated privileges. And so what you're really trying to attack there is the application suite that's being used on top of it. And yeah, a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, you're still running apps. Most of the time, the app that you're running is actually just an SSL connection to a service somewhere in the back end. So you're still effectively using a browser. And that was a great conversation that I had with Vivek about it, because when you think about it that way, that the atomic unit of work that people are doing now is an application. It's not a system. It's not an operating system. It's a thing that I do on my device. Then securing it at that atomic level is absolutely critical. And that's why I think that SquareX is an interesting solution for doing that, because they're doing it in a way that provides security and safety without being obtrusive. And that's another thing that people have to realize about security, is that when you create friction with users, you create opportunities for bypassing that friction. Think about something as simple as using authenticators. Like, it used to be a big deal that people would carry their RSA token on their keychain, right? Because they would have to dial it up and punch in that 6-digit code to be able to access the VPN to get into their office. And now I have two-factor authentication on a mobile device app, and then I can create things like passkeys that allow me to just seamlessly log in. And it creates less friction, which means that our users feel safer without even realizing that they're safe. And any company that's had an incident in the past, I don't know, however many months, where it's like, oh, hey, I need everybody to go out and change their passwords because this database got leaked or something like that. If you have a passkey, you don't have that problem because there's no password exchange. And so it creates these opportunities to create extra hyper secure connections without burdening the rest of the system. And I think that's one of the reasons why SquareX is so useful, is by putting those agents and those extensions into the browser, you're creating a secure infrastructure on the back end and nobody even knows. So you don't have to worry about installing and updating Windows Defender signatures. You don't have to worry about bypassing macOS Gatekeeper to allow this unsigned application to be installed because your development team created it for you. It just works. And when you look at the number of times that people have been embarrassed by bad security defaults, aka the infamous unsecured S3 bucket leakage, because S3 buckets were not secured by default, like it eventually got to a point where Amazon had to start securing them by default by locking them down because they were getting a black eye from the companies blaming bad security violations on a bad provider. And, something like SquareX browser extension just makes sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you said something about the ubiquity. Even though you have these little application units, they're still connecting in the back end through, SSL to some service in the back end. In the old days, right, when, like I had an Apple IIe, I think you said you had a Commodore before you went to DOS 5.0, right? What we did there is like everything was so specific to that piece of hardware that you had. Mm-hmm. And we kind of came from mainframes, and I didn't really deal with mainframes when I was a young man, right? But later on, I worked for IBM as well. And, I remember doing my expense reports on, on mainframe apps. Everything was so specific to the operating system. You were like deploying all these little pieces of code all over the place. And at some point in time, the browser came around in like the mid 90s. The first time I dealt with a browser was like 94, NCSA Mosaic browser.
Yeah.
And I really didn't think it was going to go anywhere. I thought it was going to be something completely different that made a difference. And it didn't. I mean, the browser and the way that we deploy applications, and it took a long time for applications to get to the point where, like, it seems like most applications that we use today are in the browser. Right. And it makes sense, that I don't have to deploy. All systems come with a browser. Mm-hmm. Right. And it makes it so easy to deploy an application today because you don't have to deploy a fat app with it, and worry about the configuration of the operating system and which operating system does it have the hooks and stuff that you need and the DLLs that you need to make it work. You just have a browser and the browser makes it work. And so the ubiquity of that is somewhat freeing from a developer perspective, from an enterprise IT perspective, just being able to deliver apps safely to users, we hope safely, right? But the security of the browser is, the actual application, it's come a long way in the last, 30 years.
It has. And we've gotten to a point now where we just assume that things are safe. Like you and I can both, and a lot of people listening to this podcast can remember a time when secure HTTPS connections were not the default, not the standard. I remember the day that switched over because I was working in school district IT, and suddenly kids can get to Facebook and a lot of other places because web filters stopped working because they were analyzing secure packets. Remember going through the thing where we had to tell people, look up there and see if there's a lock icon. And if the lock icon is there, then that means that the connection is secure and safe. And now they don't even display it anymore because it's just assumed that the connection is safe. I can't even remember the last time I just went to a basic HTTP site, unless it's to like trigger a captive portal at a hotel or something. And that only works because, like you said, we've gotten away from device-specific software that needs to be compiled for, the PDP or the ZX Spectrum or what have you, to something that runs on any system. Thank you, Java, for proving that could actually happen. But now the way that it's delivered is even different. And it's funny to me that a lot of applications that are being built now, especially for desktop computers, are based on Electron, which is essentially a browser window inside of an application container. And it just makes it easy to rapidly develop things. Like I know there's a lot of people that's basically how they create a Gmail client is they create an Electron wrapper that goes to Gmail and adds a few things on top of it. And you're just basically using Gmail under the hood. Now, if you'd have told that to me when I was interning at IBM 25 years ago, I would have laughed at you. What's webmail? Like, I don't understand how you can do this. And now look at us. In a world where the idea of using an application directly on my desktop is almost becoming foreign.
Yeah, and not only just using the application on your desktop, it's also your data is, in the cloud as well. I go to my iPhone or my Mac or my PC, and I can just go to my documents wherever they are. And I don't have to worry about floppy disks or CDs or copying things or trying to figure out how to copy things across the network.
I want people out there listening to this podcast, if you have ever emailed yourself a document to print it in a computer lab, I want you to leave a comment, because that is something so entirely foreign to the people entering the workforce today that it is ridiculous. The idea that I had to find a way to get my documents from where I typed them on my computer in my dorm room to the computer lab where I had a printer, and the best solution that I had was to email it to myself. And then now the idea that, honestly, for a lot of people, wait, why would you have to print your documents? Can't you just email them to the professor and then turn them in that way? Oh, yes. You sweet summer child.
Yeah. Not the way it used to be, right?
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, it's just so hard. It was so hard back then. We made it so much easier. Just kind of, closing up on the browser security part it is from like, hey, how do you go do this? It's like people get used to applications, even though some people like Chrome, some people like Firefox, some people like Safari. Back to like you were talking about, like, we think it's secure. And the only time that I ever see that it's not HTTPS, now the browsers like go crazy and they're telling me, hey, this site's not secure. You have to like click, you want to proceed? Yes, I want to proceed. I have to like force it to kind of go to an unsecure site. But that's just the communication, the protocol. That site is who they say they are, and then our communication channel is secure. What's happening inside that channel may or may not be secure, right? And I think that's where, not browser security, meaning the browser is secure, the application, but browser security in that, as you're browsing around the internet, that what you're seeing is authentic, that it is actually, Microsoft's login page and not someone else's login page. I think that's where the problems start to happen. Nowadays, we can just sign into Google with any app and just add new apps to our portfolio of apps that we're working on. And the OAuth consents and what those kinds of where they ask you for permissions, you could be transferring permissions. Those things aren't secure. You got to be very mindful about those. The extensions that you're putting in the browser that are extending the capabilities of your browser. These are other things to worry about inside a browser as well. And these are things that we, in an enterprise environment, we can't just, add whatever fat app we want on our system, right? There's always these processes, but in extension world and browser world, it's a little bit more crazy. But anyways, as we wrap up, what advice would you give someone just starting their career in networking, and what you wish you knew early on in your journey?
So I always lead with the same piece of advice, but I actually have a second one that I want to add to it. So the first piece of advice that I always tell people especially in the technology space, is never stop learning. There are always new things that are coming out. There's always a new protocol. There's always a new software application, whatever. You need to understand it. I tell my kids this all the time, because like, man, once I finally get out of high school, I won't have to study anymore. No, once you get out of high school, you have to study twice as much in your field, because there's always new things coming out. The people who sit still and say, I've learned everything there is to know and I don't need to know anymore, are the people that are afraid they're going to get replaced by insert hot new technology here, right? Automation, AI, whatever it is, because they can't keep up. And they know that because they've hit their saturation point. If you are one who's always learning, who's staying slightly ahead of the curve, you're never going to be surprised by what's coming next. But that leads to my second piece of advice. You need to ask questions. Nothing will make your career more miserable than not asking the right questions. And you're probably thinking, yeah, you're right. I need to understand how blah, blah, blah works. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about saying things like, why are we doing it this way? Can you explain to me why it has to be arranged in this order? When I was an intern at IBM, we had a script that we were supposed to use when we deployed a new ThinkPad to somebody. And They handed me the script on the first day and they said, okay, this is everything you have to do to make sure that their new machine is set up. And then immediately I was told, but we don't do it this way. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, this is the way that was approved. And this is the way that we do it that actually makes it faster. And so I never stopped asking the question, well, then why isn't this the approved way? Which led to my mentor saying, well, if you're doing it a different way, we need to investigate whether or not it's faster and produces the same results. And by the end of that, we had actually adjusted the deployment procedure to shave about 45 minutes off of a deployment. It saved like 4 different reboots of a Windows 2000 laptop. At the time was cutting edge, baby, Pentium 3 technology. But the thing is, if I had never asked the question about why are we doing a different thing than what the paper says, we would have never gotten to that point. And I know that a lot of times people feel weird about asking questions because they're like, well, it was just decided, and that's the way that it has to be. But if someone's telling you to do something and can't justify why they're doing it, it's either a really bad decision or there needs to be more thought put into it. And I can't promise you that you won't ever get in trouble for asking questions. But I can promise you that if you ask the right questions, you'll be able to sleep at night knowing that if this is the way things have to be, at least I made sure that that is exactly why they have to be the way they are.
Right. Or at least you understand. Yeah, exactly. The why, the why behind it. Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think there's 2 good pieces of advice. I mean, for my son, I have very similar advice for him. You know, one of the things I remember telling him, he's going to hate that I say this, expected his manager to, just sit there next to him and, you know, kind of teach him everything. And I was like, yeah, don't ever say that again. I said to him, I was like, you're a go-getter. You're going to, if you don't know something, you're going to do some research to try and figure out how. I mean, we have so many research tools. And I don't think people realize that, especially younger kids, realize how much information is at their fingertips, that when you and I were entering the industry, we didn't have Google. You know, we had books if we were lucky, we had a CD player that had a bunch of, you know, technology materials on it that we had to figure out how to get through. Mm-hmm. You know, there's just so many ways to just continuously learn. But like you said, I mean, it's like everything's changing every day. And if you have a passion for this, I mean, there's always something to learn. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of kept me hooked in technology is that there's always something to learn. Mm-hmm. You know, there's always a business problem that's being solved differently. And, you know, I love that advice. I love the advice that you gave. Tom, it was great having you on the Be Fearless podcast. And I think that I get to meet you at the end of September at a security tech field day, as I recall. So I look forward to meeting you in person in September.
I'm looking forward to it too. I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation. There's going to be lots of questions. And I know that I have a great group of delegates ready to learn a little bit more about what SquareX offers and, potentially give you some sage-like advice from the independent analyst community.
Yeah, I'm excited to be peppered with questions. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.